Good afternoon. I just want to welcome you all to this lecture co-sponsored by Women's Studies and by the Red Center for Western Studies, in the History Department, of Claudia Bushman. And we're going to have Rachel Cope is going to introduce her, and then the rest of the time will be yours, Claudia.
Claudia Bushman, recently retired from Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, is a renowned historian of Mormonism, particularly Mormon women. She taught American Studies at Columbia University until her retirement, when she and her husband, also retired from Columbia, agreed to help create the Mormon Studies program at Claremont. She is the author of 12 books, including A Good Poor Man's Wife, being a chronicle of Harriet Hanson Robinson and her family in 19th century New England, Contemporary Mormonism, Latter-day Saints in Modern America, and Mormon Sisters, Women in Early Utah. She has also been an incomparable mentor to LDS women interested in studying their own history. And recently, one of my students had the opportunity to meet her, and I got a message from her that said, "I just had the most wonderful conversation with Claudia Bushman. It was like meeting a celebrity for me." And I think that's how most of us here feel. So go ahead, Claudia.
Well, I'm glad to be considered a celebrity by some. My husband is the one who is considered the rock star of Mormon studies. Some time ago, our adventures with teaching Mormon studies began on a cold day in 2007. Richard and I were on a bus tour of the people working on the Joseph Smith papers, and the very generous donor who supported the Joseph Smith Papers project had invited the whole staff and their spouses on a Mormon history tour, 2 weeks long. We were all touring all over the place. We visited all the important sites, and then our own experts were filmed talking about those places. At one of the stops, Richard wandered off with Joe Bentley of Newport Beach, California. Joe is a retired lawyer who is working on the Smith Law Papers, and he was also chairman of the Mormon Studies Council of the Claremont Graduate University, which was the group working to raise the money to endow the chair of Mormon Studies at the university. And we had known of the program for some time. Richard had been out lecturing there, and we knew Karen Torgerson, who is the Dean of Religion, whose idea it was to enlist a group of significant non-clerics from each of many religious sects to support the teachings of their various disciplines at the university. Richard had been out there to lecture. Mormonism was an afterthought to that list of groups, one suggested by Karen's graduate assistant, Amy Hoyt, an LDS student who now holds a doctorate from that university. A Muslim had already been appointed to teach Islam, although the necessary $3 million had not yet been raised. The Mormon money was not in yet either, but there was a pretty good start. Joe Bentley posed a question to Richard. What would it take to get you and Claudia out to Claremont to teach Mormon studies? Well, the Bushmans are superannuated. They are also retired, but a new chapter for our book of adventures is always welcomed. And this was not an offer, of course, but just a query of interest, such as, if I asked you to marry me, what would you say? It's that kind of question. In truth, Joe officially had no say in who would fill a Mormon Studies chair, should one be funded, which it was not. The faculty members choose their own colleagues. The faculty, when they made their choice known, actually preferred another person, but an official offer was not made because the money was not quite in, and there was as yet no guarantee that actually would be raised. The Bushmans did go to California for a year to work at the Huntington Library, and then, after machinations and negotiations too complex to relate, Richard was named as a visiting Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies at the Claremont Graduate University for a term of 3 years, and I went along to teach 2. This situation held real poignancy for me. I had earned a doctorate in American and New England Studies some years before. Because I followed an illustrious husband around and was also raising 6 children, I never went on the academic market and did not have a traditional academic career. I spent my extra time teaching course by course at several different universities. I taught American Studies and the honors programs, public history, and what I called female studies. I also taught history, literature, composition. I've taught many things. Discipline drift was certainly a part of my career. I got along at this well enough until I hit a real wall. The Women's Studies Department at the University of Delaware decided that I was uniquely incapable of teaching women's studies because I was a Mormon. They refused to cross-list the class I was teaching for the honors program. I was devastated, thunderstruck, humiliated, and also upset, Were all my efforts and training for nothing? Many people didn't think I was a good enough Mormon because I'd gone to graduate school at all. And now was I too good a Mormon to even teach at a university? I tried to fight the decree, but I was only a crummy adjunct. I had no power. Eventually, I left women's studies behind, recast myself as a local historian, taught Delaware history, organized the Newark Historical Society, still standing many years later, and eventually made a place for myself in the state as the director of the Delaware Heritage Commission. When we moved to New York, as Rachel said, I taught American Studies at Columbia. But the idea of doing women's studies again, and doing Mormon women's studies, that was very exciting to me. The Claremont dean had undertaken her departmental expansion to add funds to her budget. Poor school needed money. She had carried on the effort to build local religious councils against her faculty, who were not enthusiastic about opening their ranks to sects seen as rude latecomers, particularly to Mormons. Zoroastrians, Muslims, Copts, they were okay. Mormons, not. The faculty itself was divided, rancorous and bitter. Faculty meetings were angry and painful encounters. The president of the university, badly needing money, made a secret deal that favored the Mormons. Nobody risked even informing the department members about it. They would have exploded in wrath. Richard wasn't even told. The department was a pretty toxic place, tell the truth, but Richard Bushman, the great peacemaker, entered and calmed the roiling waters. It took a while, but he was soon on good terms with the department's 2 alpha males. He dispersed courtesy and appreciation instead of snide remarks and dirty looks. Peace came to the department, and people appreciated it too. After the current dean was forced out, as she was, the new dean took Richard to lunch and asked him flatly how he could possibly believe in Joseph Smith. He answered the question calmly, without reference to dogma. He said that when he lived by Mormon principles, he was more of the kind of a man that he wanted to be, and the two became congenial colleagues. The Mormon Studies program at Claremont Graduate University soon swung into action. CGU had the first Mormon Studies graduate program and also had the first Mormon Studies program outside the state of Utah. Claremont decided to affirm that Mormonism must be treated as a religion worthy of academic study as other religious traditions. While Mormon scholars have certainly studied at various schools, various other things, studying Mormonism as a religion alongside others was a relatively new adventure for the academy. Richard taught 2 courses a semester, also covering North American religions, and I taught 1 course on women, mostly Mormon women. There was a small nucleus of students with Mormon connections and Mormon interests already at the university, and a few more intrepid students joined that group. Believers in other religious traditions also studied Mormonism. Some came to criticize and remained to be friends. Tuition was high and little scholarship money available. Still, students came, and adults too, who enrolled in the classes or audited them. The students gathered weekly for lunch and talk. they formed a cohesive group of good friends with interests in history, early Christianity, philosophy, English, theology, women's studies, Hebrew Bible, and other areas. The Mormon Studies Council, a potent group of church leaders and successful businessmen, many of them both, committed to raise the money for the Mormon Studies chair. The efforts continued to complete the $3 million endowment and to provide funds for lectures, conferences, and extra classes. The group of activists were engaged and generous, and eventually the $3 million had been raised and given to the school. The lump sum was not to last, but was much diminished by the fall of the market. Questions and demands, not to say threats, were hurled back and forth. The groups eventually came to a meeting of mind, and the council has gone on to raise more scholarship money, the greatest need right now. Almost immediately, the Mormon can-do attitude and cooperation visibly snapped into place. Our students were tapped to chair programs and run conferences. When the department secretary was asked about some detail of one of these conferences, she was heard to say, "Relax, don't worry about it. The Mormons are in charge." Mormon students were named school officers and wrote for school periodicals. At the same time, the Mormon Studies Council, with administration by Richard, sponsored a series of conferences and lectures on LDS themes offered by notable Mormon and non-Mormon scholars, people we knew mostly. These events were heavily promoted and attracted a sizable following of Mormons in the greater Los Angeles vicinity, regularly filling a very large auditorium, maybe 6-7 times this size. Good crowd, this crowd. These were, in fact, too successful. After a while, the college feared that the Mormons were making other groups look bad. And the Mormons were kindly asked to limit their big events to one a semester. They could do little events too, but one big one a semester. But that was too bad, as we had lots of other ideas in mind. It did simplify life. Every semester, some of our students would move on to jobs or other schools. Every semester, there were new people in the mix. We were there for 6 semesters, long enough to see some entering students finish up ABT, all but dissertation, and move on to other locations to write. Now we see them everywhere, speaking in conferences, teaching at BYU, working in the church history department, needing letters of recommendation, asking about readings, etc. Recently, after 2 of our Claremont students spoke in succession at a conference, Richard turned to me and said, "Our boys done good." And they did too. They were terrific. We left Pasadena, where we lived, and Claremont, where we taught, in June of 1911. June in 2011. 1911. I really live in the 19th century, not the 20th. Spending the summer in Utah, as we usually do, and then we returned to New York City. In the meantime, the Mormon moment was sizzling along. We'd been up close to Proposition 8, encountering California, and we watched the national scene with great interest. We had a potential American Mormon president. A great curiosity was building up from the grassroots. These Mormons had some crazy beliefs, but there were so many Mormon believers who seemed decent and respectable people, sensible too. Here was Mitt Romney, handsome, rich, accomplished, moral. What could be made of it? Real believing Mormons began to be called for comments on all sorts of LDS matters, when just a few years before, they were never called on, in preference to non-Mormon students of Mormonism, Jan Ships, for instance, because she seemed more trustworthy. But here were Mormons invited and trusted to speak for themselves, a welcome and potent change. Many at BYU and elsewhere were called on to comment to the national press. This was a very exciting development. The news was full of commentary about Mormons, and the commentary became increasingly intelligent and sympathetic, by some anyway. When we got back to Columbia, we found that a center at the university was offering a conference on Mormonism and politics. We weren't even doing it, not sponsored by church members, although Jana Reese did work with Randy Baumer in planning arrangements. The conference was heavily attended by Mormons and non-Mormons and by a very wide group of media. Many connections resulted. Next, we implemented an idea we had had for some time to institute an annual East Coast Traveling Mormon Studies lecture, with the same lecturer speaking in Washington, New York, and Boston. With the sponsorship of the Columbia LDSSA, we got the event scheduled on campus, and Sam Brown, the first lecturer who spoke at Columbia to a very large crowd. He spoke on the ideas of his most recent book, and the Dean of Religious Studies who attended said it was the best religious lecture she had ever heard. Matt Bowman gave the second such lecture earlier this month. He was to have done it earlier, but our recent encounter with the hurricane closed down airports, trains, and subways. These were very much high-quality Mormon studies lectures, giving some of the latest thought among intellectual circles. Should such consideration of church issues be offered at secular universities? Some here may doubt that it should. I'm convinced that it should be very much part of the presence on campuses everywhere, and that we should be part of the debate. When we first came to Columbia, I noted with great surprise that the Department of History had 4 endowed chairs of Jewish studies. 4 chairs in the history department alone, with plenty of other named chairs and gifts scattered around the university. This means that Jewish students can find a collegial home with like-minded friends. This presence creates a demand for such information as the professors impart. This means that anyone who is openly critical of Judaism or Israel speaks up at his own peril. Nobody makes jokes about Jews at Columbia. The Jews have a place at the table. The Mormons do not. We saw the difference at Claremont, where the Mormons did have a place at the table, where people took them seriously, where they were, in fact, forced to take them seriously. Richard and I got the idea to offer a class on Mormonism at Columbia. Columbia provides a wide choice of specialty undergraduate seminars in all departments, and we worked out a plan for a class on contemporary Mormonism as an undergraduate seminar and submitted it. The religion department was enthusiastic, but the university-wide committee questioned whether the topic was broad enough, their responses echoing some of the ways Mormonism has been considered in the past. But we answered their questions, and the class was approved. These classes are set for 15 students. The class filled the first day of registration. There was great interest in the topic and pressure to admit many more students. We eventually admitted 20 and had many auditors besides. We used my book, Contemporary Mormonism, as a basic text and lots of other shorter readings. Our first assignment was to attend a 3-hour Sunday series of LDS meetings. Anyone they cared to attend, and they had to write about it. We had 14 units available in Manhattan itself, meeting at different times of day, different places. The students were told that they'd be more comfortable if the men wore coats and ties and the girls wore skirts, but not to worry. Every week there were many visitors and they would not be too conspicuous. They were certainly interested, but also frightened and hesitant. They went with fear and trepidation, as well as mad curiosity, expecting to see signs of the hierarchical, authoritarian, repressive church they knew about. The 2 Orthodox Jews, forbidden to participate in any religious services but their own, had to define participation. Of course, they couldn't sing the songs, but could they open the books? Could they tap their feet to the time? These 2, in their religious garb, felt bad that no one waylaid them and tried to force baptism. The students expected to stick out. They expected to see women dressed in Amish or fundamentalist style and were surprised to find themselves underdressed. We have some pretty fancy people in New York. They didn't expect that they would be spoken to, but found that many people greeted them, questioned them, and were willing to direct them or answer questions. They didn't escape unnoticed. They didn't expect the crying babies or the apparent affection of the saints for each other, or the informality and humor in the talks and classes. For the class meetings ourselves, the ones we held, we invited in many visitors to speak. We had our bishop, the temple president, and matron. We had a gay man. We had a woman and her daughter. We had the missionaries, a number of other civilians of one kind or another. All answered all questions. All spoke very frankly, volunteering private information that no one even asked them about. Divorces, excommunication, disfellowshipping, all a big surprise to us. These were enthralling sessions. Among those who attended the class, 2 were Mormons, but this group did not disclose their identity until the end of the semester, spending most of their time listening and participating with the dual ears of members and college students, experimenting with their own identities. Could they be openly Mormon without embarrassment? They eventually came out of the closet as Mormons. Several of the students had grown up with members and admired them as really good kids. They wanted to reconcile their ideas of the church with the personalities of the church. A group of smart young women majoring in religious studies, influenced by Big Love and the Book of Mormon musical, were curious. They were testing out their religion against others. There were also some strange MAL students, they're called, studying for master's degrees in liberal studies. And these continuing students had varied and interesting backgrounds. As a group, the class was terrific, made up of excellent students, smart, informed, curious. They read the assignments, they wrote excellent papers, they said good things in class. At an honors baccalaureate service at commencement time, the 2 student speakers had just taken our class. One was a Mormon. So what is the fallout from this class? Some students said extravagant things about how much they enjoyed the class. That was nice. One young man proposed the paper he wrote for the class for a conference in Utah and came out and delivered it here. One girl brought a busload of Jewish teenagers across the country, spending the 24th of July in Utah, with Richard Bushman and Peggy Fletcher Stack as guest speakers. I was out of town then. One former GI, long-bearded and goateed, his tattoos not hidden by his tank top, was approached on the street by the missionaries who asked if he wanted to know more about the Mormon Church. He responded that he already knew a great deal because he was taking a class from Brother and Sister Bushman. He was learning the language. I hope I've made it clear that I think Mormon studies at a secular university is a good thing. Not everyone can attend BYU, except maybe this year. I don't know. As the missionary changes balance out. And when young people go to other places, it's good for them to feel some LDS presence in programs and personnel at the school. That's why I think that all institute classes should be taught on campus rather than at some ward house some distance away. The Mormon Studies chairs are a grand experiment, but no one should plan their own education with the hope of getting one. There are too few, and probably will be for a long time. Students need to prepare for much broader opportunities. Even scholars who are named to Mormon Studies chairs will have to teach other subjects as well. But there will be more and more chances to teach Mormonism. I think that LDS students benefit from LDS connections and at universities wherever they are. The Mormon moment has brought a new visibility. Other people still don't like us as a group, but they have to be prepared to deal with us. We're not going away. So I think that chairs of Mormon studies is a good idea. We have a genuine presence and can provide an LDS program of sorts. That is why the new chair of Mormon studies at the University of Virginia is such an opportunity. We may be buying our way into a situation where we cannot control appointments or curriculum, but our presence makes a difference. And in the case of that chair, we were invited in. They were asked to start a Mormon studies program in Virginia. The money has been raised. The position of a chair of Mormon studies has been announced and the applications are in. The job talks have been scheduled, and there's a strong field to be considered and to choose from. And we can certainly be proud that our excellent young scholars are being hired at excellent universities. Everyone here has probably heard how David Holland, a son of Elder Jeffrey Holland, has been offered and accepted a named chair at the Harvard Divinity School. This is an incredible coup for a young man. That makes the Holland family, the father with his Yale PhD, and he was also president of some institution around here somewhere. And Matt, who's president of UVU and so on, that makes, and David on his way to Harvard, makes them the first LDS family of education. Not that they weren't already, but it's another nail in the whatever. This is all introduction to 3 points I want to make about the experience of teaching Mormon studies in a secular environment. Mormons are divided from other people by diction and style. We are so used to speaking Mormon in terms and phrases that are familiar to us that we often do not communicate. We talk about serving instead of working. We go to our various places of abode in safety. We perform musical numbers. We have fast Sunday, mutual callings, family home evening, terms we throw around easily in our daily vocabulary. But we also have a whole vocabulary and tone of earnest belief. And when we have a missionary moment, we are expected to shift into this different argot in a heroic and unctuous tone. That people hesitate to bear their testimonies in regular conversations is because they feel the tension between these two languages. I submit that we should adopt a new vocabulary and style in standard English that lets us talk about religion without embarrassment. It's very easy for people to dismiss us when we talk Mormon. I want to propose an example of how to talk about our religion in a regular tone of voice. In a conversation, someone asks in an incredulous voice, "How can you possibly believe in appearances by God and angels, or that a golden book was dug up in New York?" You've got 3 or 4 answers in your mind. You can give them to me in a minute. Instead of reciting the articles of faith or family conversions or bearing your testimony, which introduces toxic shock into the conversation, I think a good approach is to say something like, "If you'd like to come to church with me on Sunday, I'd be happy to introduce you to lots of people who believe those things." You know, it's still my regular tone of voice, gets in an invitation to church, and yet it shows that I can talk about such things in a regular voice. We should also learn to understand the religious vocabulary of other religions and of a religious education, but I think the things that need to be said can be discussed in good standard English rather than in jargon. What we need is to find ways to discuss the church without embarrassment. That's my first point, learning the language. Number 2, we have nothing to hide and much to be proud of. The Mormon machine with all its intricate cogs is a wonder to behold. Nobody does it as well as we do. We should not try to present the church in apologetic terms that require us to try to make ourselves sound good. I sometimes cringe when I read about some of the wonderful things we do and the things we say about it. I don't think we should try to look heroic. But it is true that our saints on the East Coast volunteered 290,000 volunteer hours to clean up from the recent hurricane. We should be completely frank and open. What we are is enough. Whenever we obfuscate, we lose. We should not hide past beliefs or actions that we are now ashamed of. We are just a bunch of sinners trying to do our best. We all make and have made mistakes. Our lives are not perfect. We should own our own and the church's limitations. Many of the problems that our young people have had come from learning cleaned up versions of church history. We do not benefit from living in a culture of secrets, guilt, and fear. What other institution has a fraction of the devotion shown by thousands and thousands of our members. If Joseph Smith's greatest creation was the Mormon people, we are they, and we can be proud of what we are. And this is my final point. We should not understand the potency of individual Mormon experiences. One of our students who had always wanted to have the Spirit of God, this is a student at Columbia, always wanted to have the Spirit of God within her, found that after visiting the church, he was just suddenly there. The student decided to keep coming to the Mormon ward. She heard that the next Sunday was Fast Sunday, asked some questions of acquaintances she had at home, and decided that she would fast. She decided that $10 would be about right for 2 dorm meals, and went around the dormitory to see if she could break it 20 so she could pay fast offerings. During the following summer, she was baptized. She's now a member of the Harlem Young Adult Ward. We often see her at stake events. She did not mention any of this in class. And since then, 2 other members of the class had been baptized. We heard about the 3rd just this last week. As teachers, we work in the 3 dimensions of our topics, in, out, up, down, whatever. As historians, we work in a 4th dimension, time. As Mormons, we add a 5th dimension, the divine power of our Heavenly Father. And I speak with those 5 dimensions in mind, and in this situation, I have the luxury to be able to complete my talk in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you. Anybody got any questions they would like to ask?
What's the status of other Mormon studies programs, say, for example, in Logan and at GTU in Berkeley? How healthy are they, and how successful, and what do you see as their future?
Utah State is doing fine with Phil Barlow in charge. That's a growing program, lots of students in that. Utah Valley is a very good program. It has programs all the time. I think those 2 are the best in the state that we've got. The University of Utah has a Mormon fellowship that they are trying to raise money for, to appoint a person working on Mormon studies for a year at a time to work at the university, and that is a very successful program. Bob Goldberg, who is in charge of, I guess humanities is his operation, but he is an Eastern transplant who sees that there should be Mormon studies at the University of Utah and has done a lot to make that possible, lots of program stuff. So there are those 3. Berkeley, they're in the process of trying to raise money. Bob Reese is teaching classes. These classes are at another institution meeting across the street from the University of California, but they have access to classes and library. George and Camilla Smith, who are very big Mormon donors, are particularly interested in that, and I think they will make large donations, but I don't know anything about the money situation. I think that share is a long way from happening, but I think it probably will happen. California is a good place to have it. Stanford has shown serious interest in having more Mormon programs. They want the summer seminar, which generally meets at BYU at the Neil Maxwell Institute, to come and take place at in Stanford in the future. This is still up in the air, but it is a possibility. The real problems, I mean, this costs a lot of money to put on the summer seminar. You can afford to do it in Provo. Can you afford to do it at Stanford? Can they find sheep housing? Will they have access to the libraries, etc.? But anyway, that's the California thing, and it is growing, and it's worthwhile. There's been an effort to start a program in Mormon studies at the University of Wyoming. During one of the gas booms or something, the legislature got quite enthused about it, and they had a lot of money at that time. I haven't heard of it going anywhere for a while. Then there is, well, let's see, what else is it? The University of Virginia, we talked about that one, and various programs in Mormon classes in Mormon studies that are taught at other places. I don't have my hands on all of those, but like the one we taught at Columbia. So I'd say it's a movement that has gone a lot farther than I ever thought it would by this time. But very expensive, very hard to find the people that are willing and able to put up that kind of money. But, you know, I never thought they could raise the Claremont money. Claremont share is established. I never thought they could raise the Virginia money. There it is. So that's very promising. So, any other questions? Yes.
Question. Mormon studies at a different university, at Claremont or Virginia or Columbia for that matter, is, I imagine, in some ways different from Mormon studies here at BYU. Can you comment on some of the, as you see, the salient differences, not so much in student and audience, but in necessary approach to the subject matter?
I don't know what they teach at BYU. I'm not up on that, so I can't really make any kind of serious comparison. But I would say that at Claremont, the differences are considerable. For one thing, you talk in a different tone of voice. You use a different tone, different diction. You use the language of the academy. And you do not hide anything. Everything is open. You talk about it in a reasonable way. And that's one of the major things. But also because of the way that is structured, you don't have people getting upset about the mystical magic things of the past, because those are part of every religion. So I'd say it's a very healthy way to talk about church. You don't talk about it the way you teach Institute. You don't bear your testimony at the end of every class. Some classes you have an opening prayer in, but not always. And you just have more openness. Do you want to be more specific about what you want, or is that
No,
it?
just reflections on somebody who's, member of the church, but been working in other kinds of environments. I was curious about just your reflections on what it's like, the differences between doing something here in a summer institute, for example, and teaching someplace else where a very small fraction of the audience is actually ODS. Just what your reflections. So you answered the question in large measure.
I would say that when we got started, there weren't enough students around, so I invited in people I knew, people that were just interested. If there were wives of students, I said, why don't you just come sit in on this Mormon Studies class. Many of them picked up and became part of the class and the class work. Some of them went on to register and get degrees, so that's serious. And then Richard had a number of students, people from the Mormon Studies Council who wanted to sit in on classes, and they did. And they were high-ranking business-type people, but 2 or 3 of them have now sort of retired and are making Mormon studies their real interest, writing books. It's wonderful. Is there a question over here?
Are you surprised that BYU doesn't have a chair in Mormon studies?
Well, of course they have. Why don't they? Or you want me to comment on that?
However you want to take it.
Well, and you could say that they have, however many they have, 300,000 Mormon chairs. All these are Mormon studies chairs. All the faculty teaches Mormon studies in many real ways, but they don't teach it in a regular academic style. They teach it in a different, teach it in a church style. And that's okay, it's just different. If we want to speak to the rest of the world, we have to have a language that goes back and forth. That's all I would say. Yeah, Connie.
Are you going to continue teaching this class that you just talked about when you continue it? And are there any other classes like that you know of?
Not running at Columbia at the moment. We sort of felt like we had to fry our other fish instead of, we're retired, we're not supposed to teach anymore. But I don't know, that one really bore a lot of fruit, a lot of very interesting fruit. And there will be more, That's come from everywhere. No other questions? Oh, yeah, Brian.
You said that Virginia approached you and Richard and others about creating the chair. Can you tell us a bit about how that unfolded?
How it happened was that the chair of the University of Virginia religious studies program, which is one of the best in the nation, was out giving a talk here. And I think Jim Falconer was either his host or someone that he met at one of the meals, something. And Jim may have mentioned it or he may have heard of it somewhere else. But anyway, he asked Jim about Mormon Studies chair. And he said, well, you should talk to Richard Bushman. Gave him his number and how to reach him. And so this man called up and said that he really thought that they should have such a thing at Virginia. And did Richard think that anybody would be interested in it? And because it would require raising this money, how would the church feel about it, and so on. And so it went from there. And lots of history in between, but eventually the money was raised. And so they're very happy to have the chair. The university says they are. And of course they asked for it, they did. But not everybody. You know, religious studies program has many people, and there's at least one person who was on the search committee, who is in the department, says no Mormons should ever be hired for anything because they are all racists. You know, there's a case to be made for that. Anyway, so none of this goes smoothly, but that makes it so much more interesting. Really quite exciting to watch these things unfold. Yeah.
Have you gotten any feedback from the church or any rumors about how the brethren feel about this? About having Mormon studies at various places like Claremont?
Any from the church about what? Tell me again.
How they feel about having Mormon studies in Claremont or anywhere else? Do they
Yes.
think this is a good thing?
I'd say it's a mixed thing. There are some people like it, some don't. But the Claremont people went to tremendous effort to get permission to use the name of Howard W. Hunter for the chair because he's the Southern California apostle and president. And so they are still thrilled to have that name available. The church has had some second thoughts about that because, of course, they don't like anything named for the church that they don't have control over. And this is now an independent operation. So when it was talked about the possibility of getting the chair in Virginia named for some church member, I think just about everybody, the church included, said, no, we won't do that. So that didn't happen. And usually these chairs are named for their donors, but the donors have chosen to remain anonymous. So the donors decided to be named for Richard. So it's the Richard Lyman Bushman chair. You never know what will happen in history. Yes?
This is a really interesting moment in women's studies in the church. Do you have any comments on what's happening, like with, ordained women blogs and, I for one, am really surprised at the reaction of the church about having a woman pray in general conference. Mm-hmm. So you, as a longtime person in women's studies, what do you see?
Well, I certainly think, why not? Women should pray in church. They should pray everywhere. But
Right.
It's not a fight I would have fought. I mean, I don't think it's worth it. Now, it was a big deal when women first played the organ in General Conference, and my sister, Bonnie Goodliff, right there in pink, was the first one who did that. She played for when it was announced that she was doing that, all the women in the choir and all the women that were attending that rehearsal stood up and cheered, and some of the men too. So there are plenty of people that think women should have more exposure. I think probably most of the people here think that women should have more exposure in church, and I expect they will. It doesn't do the church any good to have them look like they are dominating women. And of course, they deny it constantly. What I say, my thing is, church is not anti-women. It's only pro-men. You see the difference. The women just don't really even matter. So I think that actually one of the things, how many people here favored wearing pants to church on Sunday for women? I don't see any hands go up at all. Nobody. See, that's another thing I would never fight for. There are plenty of people in my ward wear pants to church for one reason or another. It just doesn't seem like it's worth doing. Now, what I think we should do is, there are plenty of people who say that women should have the priesthood. Yes, we certainly know that one. What should we do about that? Well, let's have some plans. How would that work out? What do you think that would mean? What would you like the women to do? Are they to be exchangeable? Are you to give women something and the men something? If so, we've got plenty of precedents for that. You know, just let's have some plans. And if some of those look good, well, maybe we can do something about it. Any other questions? It is a big time for women. It is the time for women to do lots of things, many opportunities. All right, well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you.